Nearly 300 U.S. agriculture and forest products companies and associations delivered a letter to Secretary of Transportation Pete Buttigieg last week calling for the immediate intervention to protect U.S. exporters and their access to foreign markets. A global shortage of containers and ocean-going vessels, along with ocean carriers' increasingly frequent refusal to carry agricultural products from the U.S. back across the ocean, has led to a disastrous situation for U.S. agricultural exporters. Welcome to Feedstuffs in Focus, our podcast taking a deeper look at big issues in the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries. I'm your host, Andy Vance. Thanks for joining us. In this episode, we talk with Peter Friedman, Executive Director of the Agriculture Transportation Coalition, to get an update on the situation and discuss specific measures being proposed. This episode of Feedstuffs in Focus is sponsored by United Animal Health, a leader in animal health and nutrition. You can learn more about United Animal Health and how they're working to advance animal science worldwide by visiting the website unitedanh.com. Let's start off with the big picture. I know your organization joined almost 300 others in sending a letter to the Secretary of Transportation to talk about this ocean freight issue and what it means for agriculture and a wide range of products and commodities. But let's back up from that letter for a minute and give us the big picture, the kind of the state of affairs, if you will, as it relates to the challenge facing shippers of these commodities on the high seas.
This is such a critical issue. And as you said, there were 300 agriculture exporters that signed on to the letter. Oftentimes, companies do not want to have their own name on a letter because they worry about perhaps retaliation from an ocean carrier or something. But here we have 300, and if we would have given people more than 2 or 3 days notice, we would have had another 500 because this is a catastrophe right now. There are agriculture exporters that are going out of the business. There are some people that are not planting because they cannot afford to be in the business until this situation alleviate. So what is the situation? It began really with COVID. First, the Chinese production stopped as they were grappling with COVID there. Without production of the consumer goods that we consume here in the United States, everything we wear, our consumer electronics, our footwear, sporting goods, barbecues, everything is made in China these days. Those products were not coming into the U.S. The ocean carriers stopped carrying those cargoes to the U.S. They just laid their ships idle. That created the first hiccup because our U.S. ag exporters were not able to get the exports out because the ships weren't coming. That was the first lesson that is learned. The ocean carriers put their ships in service to carry the highest value cargo that comes across the Pacific or Atlantic. That's the import cargo, because the products we produce in this country can be produced anywhere else in the world. There's nothing we produce in agriculture or forest products in this country that cannot be sourced somewhere else in the world. If we don't deliver them affordably, dependably, then those customers will go somewhere else. What we produce is agricultural goods. Agricultural goods, because of all the global competition, has relatively lower value as compared to a container load of laptops, iPads, silk dresses, jeans. Anything we import seems to have a higher value and can pay a higher freight rate. So the ocean carriers will put their ships into service primarily to carry that inbound imported cargo to the United States. And then, to the extent they have space and time, they will take the export cargo out. So people have to first realize that if the import cargo stops coming to the U.S., the carriers are not going to come here with empty ships in order to pick up our export cargo. Our export cargo just gets stranded here. So over the course of the last year and a half, what's happened, as we all know, we've stayed at home due to COVID. We've remodeled our houses. We've redone our backyards. We've upgraded our electronics. And the volume of imports that we have coming in from Asia is at unprecedented levels. We all want everything we can get overnight by Amazon or Wayfair, so-called furniture, anything. And the volumes coming into the United States are unprecedented. There's severe competition now among importers into the U.S. for space on the ships. And as stated before, because when COVID first hit, the ocean carriers were not ordering new ships or new containers because they thought that the world's commerce would have ground to a halt and stay there, but it didn't. It recovered. So now we're short on ships, we're short on containers, and we have overwhelming volumes of import cargo coming into the U.S., paying freight rates now of, say, $12,000, $13,000, $14,000 a container coming into the U.S., whereas that container going out with hay or soybeans or even the higher value agriculture exports such as pork, beef, the chilled and frozen protein, those will pay as high as $3,500, maybe $4,000 a container. But the soybeans, the almonds, the cotton, that's paying less than $1,000 a container. So the ocean carriers are saying, what the heck? Rather than let our ocean containers go to some inland point to load up and take the time to get there in multiple days or week to get cotton or soybeans or beef or any import cargo, rather than do that, we will take that empty container once the imports have been offloaded near the ports, and we will send that empty container directly back to Asia to load it up as quickly as they can with that consumer goods coming into the U.S., which means that ocean carriers are declining to carry export cargo. About 40% of the usual volumes on the ships that are full of export cargo are not being carried. So now we have almost half of our normal loads on the ships that are filled with export cargo are now going back empty. That's stranding a lot of U.S. exports here in the U.S. That's the challenge.
So I'm thinking this through in terms of how we got here and the disparity you highlighted between the money paid to take a container load of agricultural products back across the pond versus what those inbound shippers are paying to send their manufactured goods here to the States. That's a pretty wide gulf. You're talking, it sounded like $10, $11, $12,000 in cases of disparity. So on one hand, looking at it objectively, well, gosh, that makes sense. They don't want to cool their heels waiting for those containers to come from Kansas or Missouri or Iowa or wherever back out to the port of Anaheim or Long Beach or somewhere when they could just get it back across and make that big money. So is the issue that there just aren't enough containers to facilitate keeping those ships full both directions? Is that part of the problem, or is it just, hey, you know what, we can turn the ships faster empty and let's get them moving?
Part of it is pay, but part of it is also that there is a global shortage of containers. Keep in mind, as mentioned at the beginning of this COVID crisis, they stopped ordering containers. The containers are all made in China, virtually all. And that order book for those containers was on hiatus for a while at the beginning of COVID. Even that factory that was manufacturing, those factories over there were shut down. But now they're working full bore and they're trying to catch up. The other aspect is that sometimes we can get our cargo to the ports here so that the carriers don't have to wait. But when the cargo gets over to Asia, then it does have to go inland there, the agricultural goods to the farms and so forth. Therefore, they have to wait for the containers over there. So there is a shortage of containers, which creates this problem. Another problem is that the ocean carriers are giving the champion import accounts, the Amazons, Home Depots, Lowe's, so forth, some very good terms to allow them to keep the containers much longer than usual. Typically, when the container comes off the ship, the carrier starts charging an assessment, a detention penalty that can be significant, can be between $150 to $450 a day. If that container isn't returned within a set amount of time, which typically is 5-6 days. But because Amazon and others don't have warehouses capacity, as many as they do, their capacity is insufficient to serve this huge volume of cargo that we're ordering and having delivered to our homes every day. They need places to store it. So many containers, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of containers are being used as storage. Heretofore, they never had. Now, the ocean carriers are incentivizing that behavior by giving those what are so-called champion accounts in big volumes really, really good terms like free to have those containers for extended periods of time. That exacerbates the situation.
And I'm sitting here trying to be objective, I guess. That want to be economist in me says, well, geez, Peter, you've just described market economics to me. I get why all of us in the agriculture industry are howling mad about this, but man, money talks. So let's talk about the actual policies at play here and the regulations, because there's a reason that you and your colleagues have written to the Secretary of Transportation. And I know it's not the first letter that's been sent to the administration asking them to get involved. The Federal Maritime Commission's been looking at this. Senate committees are talking about it. What's the issue here when we think about the policies at play and the regulations under which these ocean-going carriers and shippers have to abide by?
There were over 140 members of Congress, which is a huge percentage of the 535 members of the House and Senate. So that was a big number, who expressed their concerns to the Federal Maritime Commission about this situation of our exports being stranded. Secondly, keep in mind, back in November, when the ocean freight rates started really jumping for that Chinese export cargo, our imports, the Chinese Maritime Authority got involved. They act a little more quickly than our more democratic open system, and they called in a couple of the largest steamship lines one afternoon, and the next morning those two steamship lines announced that they were rescinding the freight rate increase that they had previously announced, and they were rescinding it effective immediately. So even in China, they're stepping forward to protect their exports. Now, what are specifically we're looking for? And there's some things that could help. There is a great deal of dysfunction at our marine terminals now. You've seen the pictures of 30 ships laying offshore, mostly in Southern California, but also up in Oakland, up in San Francisco Bay, up in Puget Sound. And those ocean carriers are paying a lot of money to have those ships sitting there idling for days on end. As some of the steamship line presidents overseas have said, the U.S. is the only place where the marine terminals do not operate 24/7, only place in the world. So one of our objectives is to increase the utilization of our ports so they're operating 24/7. Our ports historically were built for ships that carried 7,000 TEU, 5,000 containers, 7,000. Now the ships are coming at 18, 19, 20,000 containers. They're overwhelming our ports. So the least we can do is operate our marine terminals 24/7. The longshoremen, and we're engaging with them, the longshoremen said they absolutely like to work those, and you can understand why. The pay is really, really good for those night gates. Some of the terminal operators have said they would like to operate them as well because they want to move more cargo through. The steamship lines are the ones that have to pay for that maritime labor, that longshore labor. And at a time that the maritime industry, that the presidents of steamship lines are publicly announcing the most profitable year in anybody's history since the beginning of containerization, billions, and they are touting that to their owners and stockholders and so forth, that they are making more money than ever. We think this would be a reasonable time for them to pay for the longshoremen to work the terminals 24/7, particularly since it's ocean carrier presidents who have been attributing much of the delay to the fact that we're not operating them 24/7. So we're pulling together a coalition, really, of agriculture farmers, of the ILWU, the Longshoremen's Union on the West Coast, of some of the terminal operators. And that'll be a pretty powerful coalition because the farmers are very strong in the Republican areas, and the ILWU is very strong in the Democratic areas, but we're in it together right now. The other element is this: the Federal Maritime Commission, and this is what we're seeking from Congress, intervention. The Federal Maritime Commission studied for 2.5, 3 years, an investigation, then they conducted hearings, they had notice, and issued a regulation on what's called demurrage and detention. In other words, it's the penalties the ocean carriers charge when importer or an exporter holds a container longer than they should before returning it to the terminal. That's detention. The marine terminal and the carrier charge demurrage, and that's for not getting the container off the ship, off the terminal fast enough. Those charges are only really charged when things aren't working right. Those charges are now becoming so great, they're hundreds of millions of dollars, those penalty charges. The Federal Maritime Commission says you can't charge those penalty charges unless the importer or the exporter is at fault. If they had some ability or some control to return the container, well, then you can charge it. But if they had no ability, because maybe the ship hadn't even landed yet, how could somebody be penalized for not taking the container off the terminal when the containers were still on the ships? Crazy, right? Well, the Federal Maritime Commission investigated. They declared a rule that prohibited that behavior, and the ocean carriers have ignored it entirely. There's been no enforcement of it. We believe that if there is enforcement of that rule, the ocean carriers will work a little bit harder to eliminate some of the dysfunction and delay at the ports. But without that enforcement of that very intelligent rule that the Commission promulgated, the carriers have no incentive to change their behavior and to expedite the cargo moving through.
So when you talk about that one in particular and what the FMC can do to get involved, are there other avenues or mechanisms that the Commission or Department of Transportation or other various aspects of the U.S. regulatory schema can use to help move this issue along? And I mean, you mentioned the Chinese equivalent, calling together the presidents of the lines and kind of getting everybody on the same page in a hurry. The U.S. doesn't necessarily operate that way, as you rightly noted, but are there other methods and avenues that we have to try to get everyone on the same page? Or is it what you described earlier as one of those we have to rely on good old-fashioned coalition building to get the job done?
We believe the Shipping Act of 1984, as amended in 1998, both of them somewhat outdated, but still provide the authority. Now, I think many career people at the Federal Maritime Commission do not believe they have the authority, but I and others firmly believe the Commission has, under those acts, authority to prohibit ocean carriers from discriminating against exports. There is an element of common carriage in our transportation system, and the Commission could very well order the ocean carriers to carry the typical amount of export cargo as long as there's space on the ship to carry it safely. Typically, the ships have carried 65-75% of the export containers are loaded with the export cargo, and only 30% go back empty. Now it's reverse. There's 30 to 40, maybe 50% are loaded, and 50 to 70% go back empty. The FMC could intervene and bring an enforcement action against carriers for discriminating against export cargo. That's one heavy-handed approach, but it's one that can. The FMC has authority under prohibited acts to enforce its own rule on demurrage and detention. They don't. They say you have to bring a complaint, but let's put it this way. There are only 10 major ocean carriers now. And if you're an exporter from a certain area of the country, you may have only one or two of those ocean carriers that are going in the route you need. You may be hesitant, therefore, to bring a complaint, a formal complaint at the FMC against that one carrier that you need, for fear that the carriers say, well, in that case, maybe we're not going to have space. That's the problem when you have a very few number of service providers and many people who need the service. That's one element. The other one is the Commission has sort of this outmoded belief that you need to have a formal complaint filed. A formal complaint is about a 1.5-year process for that specific instance. And you generally will have to hire a lawyer and people who are desperate to move their cargo. And it's on one instance, on one container, that there might have been an unfair charge. You have to file a complaint, go through this whole process when you have thousands of those containers and instances. So it's just unrealistic, uneconomic, doesn't happen. There is legislation that's been proposed, and it's circulating on Capitol Hill, that would put some teeth into the Federal Maritime Commission's, again, excellent detention demurrage rule that was spearheaded by Commissioner Rebecca Dye, who took the bull by the horns and ran this whole investigation and rulemaking and so forth for the last 3 years. Terrific job. Now we got to enforce it. And we think it could require an amendment to the Shipping Act, and it could change the process. We have an idea. Before the ocean carrier imposes this detention demurrage charge, they have to certify that it complies with the rule. Right now, what happens, they're issuing these charges, as I said, hundreds of millions of dollars. Some of our nation's largest agriculture exporters are paying more in these detention demurrage charges than in the freight charge, which contributes to the very fine profits that the ocean carriers are making, because on the export, they're making double now. Much of it from these penalties, and almost all those penalties violate the FMC's rule. So if the carriers would have to certify compliance before they issue it, I think they'd be hesitant to issue all those. Right now, they say, well, the computers just spit it out and you can then appeal to us for a waiver. That's a long process.
Sure. Put the onus on the carrier to get it right up front, as opposed to on the shipper, the client, to come back afterward and say, hey, you charged me unfairly. It seems like a simple fix, which probably means it's too much to hope it will happen, right? But certainly makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And Peter, I really appreciate you walking us through what's a pretty thorny issue, and one that has really made quite a dent in the agricultural commodities, specifically the feed industry and livestock trade. Peter Friedman, Executive Director of the Ag Transportation Coalition. This episode of Feedstuffs in Focus is sponsored by United Animal Health, a leader in animal health and nutrition. You can learn more about United Animal Health and how they're working to advance animal science worldwide by visiting the website unitedanh.com. For the latest reporting on freight and transportation policy, as well as other policies and legislation related to livestock and animal feed production and how it affects your business specifically, visit our website, feedstuffs.com. My conversation with Peter Friedman was part of a session earlier this week that streamed live via our new virtual community and events platform, Feedstuffs 365. I hope you'll join us there for more content of interest featuring some of the top minds in the animal protein industries. I'm Andy Vance, and you've been listening to Feedstuffs in Focus. Thanks for joining us today. If you want to hear more conversations about some of the big issues affecting the livestock, poultry, grain, and feed industries, subscribe to this podcast on your favorite platforms, including Apple and Google Podcasts, or visit our website, feedstuffs.com, for future episodes. Until next time, have a great day, and thanks for listening.